The gavel was still in the drawer when my clerk set the folder on my desk at exactly 9:14 in the morning on a Wednesday in October, and I remember the sound it made more than I remember anything else about that day. A soft, papery slap, the kind of sound a folder makes 1,000 times a week in a courtroom and means absolutely nothing until the one time it means everything. I did not open it right away. I was still holding my coffee, and the steam was still curling up off the top of it, and I was thinking about nothing more important than whether I needed to stop for gas on the way home. Then I looked down at the case caption typed across the top of the folder in the same plain Courier font. Every case caption in that courthouse had been typed in for 30 years, and I read a name I had heard exactly one time before, spoken across a dinner table in a voice that still lived somewhere behind my sternum, like a splinter that never quite worked its way out. Poor trash. That was what she had called me. Not to my face exactly. She had said it about me. At a table full of people who loved her more than they knew her. In a dining room with white tablecloths and candles that cost more than my grocery bill for the week. And she had said it the way you say something you believe is simply, obviously true. The way you'd say the sky is blue. And I had sat there in my good cardigan, the navy one with the small pearl buttons that I had owned for 11 years, and I had said nothing at all, because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. I let people show me exactly who they are, and then I remember it carefully. The way you remember a fact you might need later. I had absolutely no idea, sitting there with my coffee going cold and my hand resting flat on a manila folder I had not yet opened, that later had arrived. Neither did she. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, though almost nobody has called me Eleanor since my mother passed. Everyone calls me Ellie, and they have called me that since I was a girl running barefoot through a tobacco field outside Hendersonville, North Carolina, chasing a dog that never once came when it was called. I am 62 years old. I live on 4 acres about 18 miles outside Asheville, in a farmhouse my late husband and I bought in 1994 for a number so small it would make a real estate agent laugh out loud today. And I drive a 2011 Ford Escape with 191,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield I have been meaning to fix since Easter. I wear the same 3 cardigans in rotation. I clip coupons out of the Sunday paper, not because I need to, particularly, but because my mother taught me that $1 saved carelessly is $1 you will regret spending, and some habits get into your hands before they ever get into your head, and by the time you're grown, they simply live there, the way calluses live on the palms of a man who has spent 40 years with a hammer. I have been a judge for 11 years. Before that, I was a public defender for 19. Before that, I was a girl who worked the overnight shift at a diner off Highway 25 to pay her way through community college. Then 4 more years to finish her degree at night while raising a boy alone. Then 3 more after that to get through law school with a stack of loans I did not finish paying off until I was 49 years old. Nobody handed me anything. I want to say that plainly once, right at the start, because it matters for everything that comes after it. There were years in law school when I worked a closing shift at that same diner 3 nights a week, came home smelling of grease and coffee, sat at a kitchen table with a 2-year-old finally asleep down the hall, and read case law until my eyes burned, because that was the only quiet stretch of hours the day had left to give me. I did not marry into money. I did not inherit a firm with my name already on the letterhead. I built what I have out of double shifts and library carols, and a kind of stubbornness that I am not sure is admirable so much as it is simply the only gear I have ever had. My husband, Walter, died 9 years ago. Heart sudden, on a Tuesday, in the garden, with his hands still in the dirt around a row of tomato plants he never got to harvest. I found him 40 minutes later when I came out to call him in for supper. I do not tell that story often, and I am not going to dwell on it here, except to say that grief teaches you something about what actually matters and what is simply noise. And once you have learned that lesson all the way down to the bone, very little that comes out of another person's mouth can rattle you the way it might have rattled you at 30. I had already survived losing the one person whose opinion of me mattered more than anyone else's on this earth. After that, most insults just sort of slide off, the way rain slides off a tin roof. Most, not all. There's always one that finds the gap. There's one more piece of the backstory wound I have never told anyone outside of Marion, and I am only telling it now because I think it explains, better than anything else could, Why the phrase poor trash did not simply glance off me the way an insult from a stranger might have. When I was 9 years old, my mother took in laundry and ironing for 3 families in town to supplement what the tobacco farm paid her, which was, by any fair accounting, almost nothing. One of those families, the Ashfords, lived in a brick house on the good side of Hendersonville with a wraparound porch and a housekeeper of their own. And every Thursday my mother would walk the mile and a half there with a basket balanced on her hip, and I would sometimes walk with her, because it meant I got to sit on their back steps and read while she worked. I remember once standing in their kitchen doorway at maybe 10 years old, hearing Mrs. Ashford tell a friend on the telephone, in a voice that clearly assumed no one who mattered could hear her, "Oh, that's just Ellie. She comes with her mother. Sweet little thing. But you know how those families are." How those families are. I did not fully understand the sentence at 10, but I understood the tone of it perfectly. The same tone Vanessa would use 52 years later at a restaurant table in Charlotte. I understood, even at 10, that some people had decided, before ever really looking at you, what category you belonged to, and that no amount of good behavior on your part would ever quite move you into a different one in their eyes. My mother never once, in the 11 years I watched her carry that laundry basket, apologized for who she was or where we came from. She held her back straight walking up that Ashford driveway every single Thursday, and she held it just as straight walking back down. I did not fully understand, until I was much older, that this was its own kind of lesson, taught silently, the way the truest lessons usually are. Walter and I had one son, Daniel. He is 34 now, an electrical engineer, gentle in the particular way that boys raised mostly by their mothers sometimes are, careful with his words, quick to apologize even when he has done nothing wrong, uncomfortable with conflict in a way I have always half blamed myself for and half been grateful for. He was 7 when his father and I bought this farmhouse. I remember him running through the empty rooms before we had a single stick of furniture in them, his sneakers echoing off the bare pine floors, shouting that he had found his room, and then 5 minutes later, shouting that he had found a better one. That sound, sneakers on empty floorboards, a boy's voice bouncing off walls that didn't have anything on them yet to absorb it, is still, 9 years after losing Walter and 27 years after that particular afternoon, one of the 2 or 3 sounds I would choose if I could only keep one sound from my whole life. The other is Walter humming while he shaved, off-key, always the same 4 bars of some hymn he could never remember the rest of. I tell you these things not because they matter to the case. They do not legally, not in any way a court would recognize, but because they matter to understanding why what happened at that dinner table hurt as much as it did. When someone calls you poor trash, they're not simply commenting on your bank balance. They are trying to tell you that the life you built, plank by plank, debt by debt, decade by decade, does not count. That the boy who ran through empty rooms and the man who hummed off-key while shaving and the years of overnight shifts and library carols add up to nothing, because you do not currently own the right handbag. I have sat on the bench for 11 years and heard people lie to me in every register human beings are capable of lying in, and I promise you, the lie in that sentence, the lie that a modest life is a lesser life, is one of the oldest and most successful lies there is. It works because just enough of us, deep down in some tired, undefended corner, are afraid it might be true. There was one more thing about my marriage to Walter that I want you to see clearly before the villain of this story ever walks onto the page, because I do not want you to understand our family only through the shape of its wound. I want you to understand what was actually at stake in it. Walter and I married young, at 24 and 26, with nothing between us but a truck he'd bought with cash he'd saved working at a lumber yard, and a ring so small the jeweler had thrown in the resizing for free out of what I have always suspected was pity. We did not have money for a honeymoon, so Walter drove us 4 hours to the coast in that truck, and we slept in the bed of it under a tarp he'd rigged up like a tent, and he woke me before sunrise to watch the light come up over the water, and he said, watching it, not looking at me at all, "I don't have much to give you, Ellie, but I promise you'll never once wonder whether I meant it." He kept that promise for 31 years. Every single morning of our marriage, without fail, he made the coffee before I woke, and he left my cup on the counter, black, no note, because the coffee was the note. That is the marriage a woman was defending, without ever raising her voice, when a stranger at a dinner table decided that same woman's entire life could be summarized in 2 careless words. I was not afraid it was true. I want to be honest about that too. I sat at that table, and I heard those 2 words, and something in my chest went very still and very quiet. The way a room goes quiet right before a storm changes direction. Not hurt exactly. Recognition. I thought, in that half second before I decided what my face would do next. I know exactly what you are now, and I am going to remember it. Vanessa Calloway came into our family 2 years ago, on Daniel's arm, at a Sunday dinner I hosted at the farmhouse, because that is where Sunday dinners have always happened, going back to before Daniel was born, back to when it was Walter's mother hosting them in this exact kitchen with the same scarred butcher block counter I still use today. Vanessa was, by any objective measure, dazzling. Tall, composed, dressed in a way that looked effortless, and it clearly cost a great deal of effort. She came from what the society pages of the Asheville paper like to call an old Charlotte family. Real estate money 3 generations deep, a father who sat on hospital boards, and a mother who chaired charity galas. The kind of wealth that has learned to speak in a soft voice because it has never once needed to raise it to get what it wants. She was, that first Sunday, perfectly charming. She complimented my kitchen. She asked about my work in a way that seemed genuinely curious. She brought a bottle of wine that cost more than I typically spend on groceries in a week, and she presented it with a small, practiced humility, as though it were nothing, as though it were the kind of thing anyone might pick up on the way over. I remember thinking, watching her laugh at something Daniel said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, that my son had found someone lovely, and that I hoped lovely went all the way through. It is only in hindsight, and hindsight, in this line of work, is a tool I have learned never to trust completely, because it flatters itself. It makes you believe you saw things you only assembled afterward, that I can identify the first small signal that something underneath the charm did not quite match the surface. It happened that same first Sunday, in my own kitchen, at 4:52 in the afternoon, while I was pulling a roast out of the oven. Vanessa had excused herself to use the bathroom, and on her way back through the hallway, she paused at the little gallery wall where I keep photographs. Daniel's kindergarten picture, Walter and me at our wedding in 1988, a photo of my own mother standing in front of the tobacco farm she worked her whole life and never once owned. Vanessa looked at that last photograph for perhaps 4 seconds. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, drying my hands on a dish towel. Her face did something small and quick. An inventory is the only word I have for it. The particular flicker of a person doing quiet arithmetic about what a life like that must be worth, and coming up with a number that did not impress her. Then she smiled, turned, and rejoined the table, and complimented the roast, and I told myself I had imagined it. There was a second small signal, months later, that I also filed away, without quite naming it at the time. Vanessa and Daniel had come to the farmhouse for 4th of July cookout, and at one point, while Daniel was inside refilling the lemonade pitcher, I watched Vanessa take a phone call out on the porch. Her voice, which around the family had always carried a bright, easy warmth, dropped into something flatter and more clipped the moment she believed she was out of earshot. A voice, I understood only much later, that belonged to Ashcombe Wealth Partners rather than to Sunday dinners. No, tell him the allocation stands. He doesn't need the details. He just needs to feel like he was consulted, she said, glancing once toward the kitchen window to make sure no one was near it, then walking further down the porch steps, out of what she believed was hearing range. I was standing at the sink with the window cracked for air, and I heard every word of it, and I remember thinking, in the ordinary, unremarkable way you think something, and then set it down to go on with your day. That is not how I would want anyone managing my money. Then Daniel came back out with the lemonade, and Vanessa's voice brightened again the instant the call ended, and I did what people do with small, unfinished suspicions everywhere. I let it go, because it was a beautiful July afternoon, and because I did not yet have any reason strong enough to hold on to it. I had not imagined it. I want to be careful here, because I do not believe in painting anyone as a cartoon, and I do not believe Vanessa Calloway woke up any single morning of her life intending to be cruel. I believe, and I still believe now, that she is the product of a very particular kind of upbringing, one where worth is quietly, constantly measured, where a person's value gets assessed the way a piece of real estate gets assessed, and where nobody ever quite says the ugly part out loud, because saying it out loud would be common, and common was the one thing Vanessa Calloway had been raised, from birth, to never ever be. The explicit moment, the moment where the quiet arithmetic finally became a sentence spoken out loud, came 18 months later, at Daniel and Vanessa's second anniversary dinner, at a restaurant in Charlotte with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than most contracts I have read. I had driven the 2 hours down because Daniel asked me to, and because I have never once, in 34 years, missed a chance to sit near my son when he wanted me there. There were 14 of us at the table, Vanessa's parents, her 2 sisters and their husbands, a handful of family friends I had met once or twice, and me, at the far end, in my navy cardigan with the pearl buttons, having driven myself 2 hours in a car with a cracked windshield to sit at a table where the appetizer alone cost more than I typically spend on dinner for a week. At 8:41 that evening, one of Vanessa's sisters asked me, kindly enough, what I did for work. I told her, simply, that I worked in the court system. I have never once, in my entire career, opened with the word judge at a dinner table. It is not modesty exactly, though people are welcome to call it that. It is something closer to a private rule I made for myself decades ago, back when I was a public defender making less money than the paralegals at the firms across the street. I decided early on that I did not want to be treated differently because of a job title, and the surest way to prevent that was to simply not lead with it. Let people treat you the way they would treat anyone. That tells you far more about them than any title ever will. Vanessa's sister pressed, pleasantly, court system, doing what exactly? And before I could answer Vanessa, 2 glasses of wine in, laughing at something her father had said a moment earlier, not even fully looking my direction, said, loud enough for at least half the table to hear, in the light, careless tone of someone repeating a fact everyone already knows. Oh, Ellie does clerical work down at the courthouse. Filing mostly. It's very sweet, actually. She's been doing it forever. Filing. Very sweet. Nobody at that table corrected her, because nobody at that table knew any better. Daniel was 3 seats down, deep in a conversation with Vanessa's father about a lake house, and did not hear it at all, and I have never told him he did not hear it, because some things a mother simply decides to carry alone. I sat with my water glass in my hand, and I said nothing, and I smiled the particular smile I have spent 11 years on the bench perfecting, the one that gives away exactly nothing, and I let the moment pass, and the conversation moved on to someone's renovation, and the check eventually came, and Vanessa's father insisted on paying it with the easy generosity of a man who has never once had to think about what a number on a check means. It was in the car alone, on the drive back up the mountain at close to 11 at night, windows cracked because I needed the cold air on my face, that the second thing happened. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat where I tossed it, a single text notification lighting the screen in the dark. It was not meant for me. It was, I would learn only much later, meant for Vanessa's sister. A message sent to the wrong thread. The way these things always seem to happen. Some cosmic clumsiness in the universe that seems to specialize in delivering exactly the wrong message to exactly the wrong person at exactly the moment it will do the most damage. Except it was not sent to the wrong thread. It was sent, I understood only weeks later, directly to a family group chat that had, at some point, without my knowledge, included me. Added, I assume, in some administrative sweep when the wedding planning had been underway 2 years earlier, and never removed. The message read, God, did you see the cardigan tonight? Poor thing has no idea how any of this works. Danny's mom is basically poor trash, but she means well, I guess. I read it once in the dark car on the side of the mountain road, engine idling, my own breath fogging faintly against the cold glass. I read it a second time. My hands did not shake. That surprised me a little in the moment. I had expected shaking, or heat behind my eyes, or the particular hollow drop in the stomach that comes with being wounded by someone you had genuinely hoped might turn out to be good. What I felt instead was something quieter and, if I am honest, colder. A kind of settling. The way water settles once you finally set the glass down on a level surface after carrying it too full across a room. Poor trash. I did not respond to the message. I did not screenshot it and send it to Daniel. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat and I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, and I let myself into the dark farmhouse, and I stood in my own kitchen, the same kitchen where I had pulled a roast out of the oven while a young woman quietly appraised my mother's photograph and found her wanting, and I poured myself 2 fingers of the bourbon Walter used to keep in the cabinet above the refrigerator, and I sat at the table, and I let myself feel it, all of it, for about 11 minutes, by the clock on the stove. Then I rinsed the glass, set it in the drying rack, and went to bed. I did not know that night that the woman who had called me poor trash in a group chat, she did not know I was on wood, within 4 months, have her name land on a case file crossing my desk. I could not have known. Nobody could have known. That is simply how these things happen. Not with drama, not with foreshadowing, but with the ordinary, indifferent machinery of a courthouse randomly assigning a case number to whichever judge's rotation happens to be next in line. Fate, if you want to call it that, does not announce itself. It just shows up on a Wednesday morning at 9:14, in a manila folder, smelling faintly of toner. The folder my clerk set on my desk that October morning contained a civil complaint. I want to explain briefly what that means for anyone unfamiliar with how courts work, because it matters. A civil complaint is not a criminal charge. Nobody was accused of a crime in that folder. It was a lawsuit, Whitmore versus Ashcombe Wealth Partners, filed by an 81-year-old widow named Ruth Whitmore against a boutique financial advisory firm that had, over the course of 3 years, moved the bulk of her late husband's estate into a series of increasingly aggressive, increasingly opaque investment vehicles, extracting fees at every turn, until nearly 60% of what should have been Ruth Whitmore's retirement security had simply evaporated into management fees, advisory, service charges, and one particularly troubling series of transfers into a shell entity that existed, as far as the complaint alleged, for no purpose other than to generate commission for the advisor who managed the account. The advisor's name, listed on the second page of the complaint, in the same plain courier font, was Vanessa Marsh Calloway. I sat very still for what must have been close to a full minute, my coffee cooling beside me, before I picked the folder back up and read the caption a second time, just to be certain my eyes had not simply substituted a name I had been thinking about for a name that was actually printed there. It had not. It was her. Ashcombe Wealth Partners was a small, boutique advisory firm Vanessa had left her family's real estate business 2 years earlier to help build. The one she talked about, on the rare occasions family conversation turned to her work, as helping people protect what they've worked their whole lives for. I remembered her saying that, almost verbatim, at a Thanksgiving dinner the year before, her hand resting on Daniel's shoulder, her voice warm with the particular sincerity of someone who has practiced a sentence enough times that it has started to sound true even to herself. I want to describe, honestly, what happened to my body in the 60 seconds after I confirmed it was her. My hands went cold. In October, in a courthouse where the radiators run so hot in the fall that my clerk keeps a small fan on her desk out of habit, my hands went cold anyway. The particular deep cold that has nothing to do with the temperature of a room and everything to do with the temperature of a fact you were not prepared to hold. The sound in the hallway outside my chambers, a cart being wheeled somewhere, a door closing, ordinary courthouse noise, seemed to arrive from very far away, as though someone had turned the volume of the entire building down to almost nothing. I sat with the folder open in front of me, and I did not move for what my clerk later told me was almost 4 full minutes, and when she finally knocked and asked if everything was all right, I told her yes, and I believe my voice sounded almost entirely normal, because that is a skill I have had 11 years to practice. I read the complaint in full before I did anything else. That was not sentiment. That was procedure, and procedure, in moments like that one, becomes a kind of scaffolding you can stand inside when everything else feels like it is threatening to give way. Ruth Whitmore, the complaint alleged, had come to Ashcombe Wealth Partners 3 years earlier, 7 months after her husband's death, at the recommendation of a friend from her church. She had explained clearly, in her very first meeting, that her only goal was security, enough income to stay in her home, cover her medications, and leave a modest inheritance to her granddaughter, who was raising 2 children alone in Knoxville. The complaint included, as an exhibit, a memo from that first meeting, typed and initialed by Vanessa Calloway herself, in which she had written verbatim, in a section labeled Client Objectives. Client is risk-averse, elderly. Primary goal capital preservation, not growth. Recommend conservative allocation only. 3 pages later, in an internal email dated 14 months after that first meeting, an email that had surfaced during discovery, subpoenaed from the firm's own servers, an email Vanessa almost certainly believed no one outside the firm would ever read. She had written to a colleague, "Whitmore is sitting on 1.4 M doing nothing. She's 81. She doesn't need growth. She needs us to hit our numbers this quarter. Move her into the Meridian vehicle. Tell her it's diversification. She won't ask follow-up questions. She never does. She won't ask follow-up questions. She never does." I read that sentence 3 times. I want to tell you honestly that it was not, in that moment, my daughter-in-law's cruelty toward me that hit hardest. It was this, an 81-year-old widow, grieving, trusting, doing exactly what she had been taught her whole life to do. Trust the nice young woman with the kind voice and the good manners, who said she wanted to help protect what she'd worked for, had been quietly, deliberately, described in a private email as a mark. Not a client. A mark. Someone whose trust was not a responsibility to be honored, but a resource to be extracted, methodically, over years, because she was old enough and polite enough and unsuspecting enough that she would never think to ask a follow-up question. I thought, sitting in my chambers with that email in front of me, of my own mother, standing in front of that tobacco farm and the photograph on my hallway wall, a woman who had worked land she never owned, for people who never once, in 40 years, learned to say her first name correctly. I thought of Ruth Whitmore's granddaughter in Knoxville, raising 2 children alone, waiting on an inheritance that had been quietly converted into someone else's commission. And then, and only for a moment, because I made myself set it aside almost as soon as it arrived, I thought of the message that had come to my phone in the dark, on the side of a mountain road. Poor thing has no idea how any of this works. She had built an entire career on precisely that sentence, on finding people who, in her estimation, had no idea how any of this worked, and making certain they never found out until it was too late to matter. Under the Code of Judicial Conduct I have sworn to uphold for 11 years, a judge is required to disclose, and in most circumstances to recuse from, any case in which the judge has a personal relationship with a party that a reasonable person might believe could affect impartiality. There was no question, none whatsoever, about what I was required to do. Vanessa Calloway was my daughter-in-law. I could not sit as the judge on her case. I want to be entirely clear about that, because I know how these stories can be told, as if the poor, wronged mother-in-law used the bench as her own private instrument of revenge, banged a gavel, delivered a verdict, and walked off triumphant. That is not what happened, and if it had happened that way, I would not be able to look at myself in the mirror, let alone tell you this story with any pride at all. What actually happened was quieter, slower, and in its own way far more devastating than any dramatic courtroom scene could have been. But before disclosure, before the moment where the truth would necessarily become known to Vanessa, to Daniel, to the entire family, there were 9 days. 9 days where I alone, and eventually one trusted colleague, knew what I knew, and where I had to decide, carefully and deliberately, exactly how to carry that knowledge without letting it show on my face at the family dinner Daniel had already asked me to attend that Sunday. The first person I called was Judge Marian Alvarez, who had sat 2 doors down from my chambers for 11 years, and who I trust more than almost anyone left alive, who is not my own son. Marian is 70 years old, silver-haired, a retired Army JAG officer before she ever put on a robe, and she has the particular gift of saying something true in as few words as possible. I called her that same Wednesday afternoon, closed my door, and told her everything. The dinner, the group chat message I had never mentioned to anyone, the name on the complaint. She listened without interrupting, the way she listens to everyone, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said the sentence I have not been able to stop turning over since. "Ellie, the 2 of you have been building toward this exact moment for 2 years. You just didn't know it yet. She's been telling you who she is the whole time. You're only just now being handed the paperwork." I recused the following morning, at 10:03, filing the standard disclosure with the clerk of court, citing a familial relationship with a named party, and requesting reassignment to another judge in the district. That part of the process is almost entirely bureaucratic. A form, a signature, a case number reassigned through the same and different rotation that had handed it to me in the first place, this time routing it to Judge Preston you 3 floors up. What is not bureaucratic, what the paperwork cannot capture at all, is what happens to a person during the 9 days between reading a name on a complaint and having that name find out you read it. I performed normalcy for those 9 days the way I imagine an actress performed a role she has grown so tired of she can barely remember the words are not simply her own. I went to Daniel and Vanessa's for Sunday dinner at their townhouse in the historic district, with its restored crown molding and its kitchen island that cost, I happen to know now from the discovery documents, roughly what Ruth Whitmore lost in a single year of advisory fees. I sat at their table. I complimented the chicken. I asked Vanessa, with what I hoped sounded like genuine warmth, how work was going, and she told me, brightly, that the firm had just closed its best quarter yet, and I said that was wonderful, and I meant, silently, in the specific quiet part of myself that had already read the exhibits, I know exactly whose money made that quarter what it was. I want to be honest that this was not easy, and I do not think it should sound easy in the telling. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding your face steady while your mind is somewhere else entirely. The exhaustion of smiling at 6:40 in the evening over a chicken dinner while thinking about an 81-year-old woman's bank statements. I went home those nights and sat in my own kitchen, at my own table, with the light off, more than once, simply because I did not yet have the energy to turn it on. During those same 9 days, I did what any careful person in my position would do, which is to say, nothing that could be mistaken for interference, and everything that could be understood as ordinary diligence. I did not contact Ruth Whitmore. I did not contact Ruth Whitmore's attorney. I did not review a single document related to the case beyond what I had already read before recusing, and I logged, in writing, the exact date and time I had done so, because I have watched enough careers unravel over far smaller lapses in judgment to know that the appearance of propriety matters exactly as much as propriety itself. What I did do, the one thing I allowed myself, was watch. Publicly filed documents in a civil case are, by definition, public. Anyone can read them. I read them the way any interested member of the public might, in the evenings, at my own kitchen table, under my own reading lamp, and what I read, over those 9 days, painted a portrait of my daughter-in-law that was considerably more thorough, and considerably more damning, than a single overheard insult at a restaurant table ever could have been. Ruth Whitmore was not, it turned out, the only client. The complaint, once amended, eventually named 3 additional elderly clients whose accounts had followed a nearly identical pattern: conservative stated goals, aggressive undisclosed reallocation, fees extracted at every step, all of it dressed in the soft, reassuring language of diversification and growth opportunity. One of the 3, a widower named Harold Beckett, had died 8 months into the pattern before the fraud was ever discovered, and his estate, what should have gone to his 2 grandsons, had been reduced by nearly 40%. I sat at my kitchen table on the 7th night, reading Harold Beckett's original client intake form, in which he had written, in the section asking about his goals, in handwriting that had clearly begun to shake with age. Just want to leave something for the boys. Don't need much for myself. I thought about Walter, humming off-key while he shaved. I thought about the tomato plants he never got to harvest. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me in its coldness, that whatever complicated grief I still owed my daughter-in-law for the family I had hoped she would become part of, I did not owe her a single ounce of protection from what her own choices had built. There was a 4th exhibit in the complaint, added in an amendment filed the following week, that I did not read until my recusal was already final, and that I only mention now because it is the piece of the record that has stayed with me the longest. It was a single voicemail transcript, subpoenaed from the firm's recorded client services line, left by Ruth Whitmore on a Sunday evening 11 months into the relationship at 7:48 p.m. Her voice, according to the court reporter's careful transcription, described in the margin as elderly, tremulous, apologetic in tone. The transcript read, in part, "Vanessa, honey, it's Ruth again. I'm sorry to call so late. I looked at the statement you sent, and I don't quite understand where the Meridian money went, and I don't want to bother you. I know you're busy. You're always so busy. But if you could just call me back when you have a minute. No rush at all. I trust you completely. I really do. No rush at all. I trust you completely. The complaint noted that Ruth Whitmore's call was not returned for 11 days, and that when it finally was returned, the conversation lasted 4 minutes and ended with Ruth thanking Vanessa for her patience. I sat with that transcript a long while, at my own kitchen table, under my own reading lamp, and I thought about how trust, offered that plainly and that generously by someone who has no reason left in her life to be anything but honest, is possibly the single most valuable thing one human being can hand another, and how casually, how completely, it had been spent. Courtroom 4 smelled, that morning, the particular way old courthouses smell in autumn, floor wax and radiator heat, and the faint mineral tang of paper that has passed through a copier one too many times, a smell I have walked into thousands of mornings across 11 years without ever once really noticing it. Except that morning I noticed everything. The way you notice the ordinary details of a room right before something in it is about to change permanently. The disclosure hearing, the formal moment where my recusal was entered into the record and where, under the court's own rules, the reason for it had to be stated plainly, took place on a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, in Courtroom 4, the smallest of the district's courtrooms, wood-paneled, with a single window that let in a shaft of October light that fell directly across the defendant's table. I was not the presiding judge for this hearing. Judge, you presided, as was proper, with me appearing only as the recusing judge, required by protocol to state my relationship to the defendant on the record before formally stepping aside. Vanessa did not know, walking into that courtroom that morning at 8:53, dressed in the kind of tailored charcoal suit that says quiet competence to a jury before she has said a single word, that the judge originally assigned to her case, the judge who had, for 9 days, read every publicly available document related to her conduct, was the mother-in-law she had described. In a group chat she did not know included me, as poor trash. I watched her walk in from a side door reserved for court personnel, and I watched her see me, seated not at the bench, but in the small gallery of chairs reserved for court staff and observers, wearing my robe, and I watched something move across her face. First simple confusion, the mild, polite confusion of someone encountering a family member in an unexpected professional setting, and then, over the space of perhaps 3 full seconds, something else entirely. I watched her count backward. I watched her arrive, almost visibly, at the sentence. She read the case file. She has known for days. She was going to be my judge. Judge, you called the matter to order at 9:04. He is a careful, deliberate man, not given to theater, and he handled the disclosure exactly the way it is meant to be handled, briskly, procedurally, without a single unnecessary word. The court notes for the record, he said, that this matter was originally assigned to Judge Eleanor Whitfield, who has filed a disclosure indicating a familial relationship with the named defendant, Vanessa Marsh Calloway, and has properly recused herself. The matter is reassigned to this court. Judge Whitfield, is there anything further you wish to place on the record? There was a version of this moment I could have chosen, a version where I stood, turned to Vanessa, and delivered every sentence I had been carrying since the night that message lit up my phone in the dark on the side of a mountain road. I had imagined that version, I will admit, on at least one of those 9 sleepless nights. I did not choose it. I stood, and I said, into the small silence of that wood-paneled courtroom, exactly 11 words. No, Your Honor, only that I have recused properly and completely. Then I sat back down. Vanessa's attorney, a sharp, capable litigator named Frank Doskin, who I had appeared opposite more than once in my years as a public defender, requested a brief recess before proceeding further, and Judge, you granted it. I watched from my seat in the small gallery as Doskin leaned toward Vanessa and spoke to her in a low, urgent voice, and I watched Vanessa's composure, the same composure that had carried her through 14 months of client meetings where she assured elderly widows their money was safe, hold for almost the entire length of that whispered conversation, and then falter, visibly, at one specific point. Her eyes found me again across the courtroom. I did not look away, and I did not soften my expression into anything that could be mistaken for either cruelty or comfort. I simply let her see plainly that I was still exactly who I had always been, the same woman in the cardigan, the same woman she had once decided, without ever really looking, did not matter enough to require careful words. When the recess ended, Doskin rose and requested, on the record, a short continuance to allow his client time to secure new counsel, given what he called the unusual circumstances of the case's procedural history. A request Judge you granted without comment. It was, I understood later from Marion, an unusually candid admission from an attorney of Doskin's caliber, an acknowledgement, however indirect, that the ground beneath his client's case had just shifted in a way that would require real strategy to survive. That was the entirety of my public role in the matter. 11 words. No speech. No confrontation. No moment where I stood over her the way she once, without knowing I would ever find out, stood over the memory of a photograph of my mother in a hallway and quietly decided what it was worth. I want to be honest that some part of me, the part that is still, underneath 11 years on the bench, a girl who once sat silent at a table while someone called her mother's life work worthless, wanted more than 11 words. But dignity, I have learned across 62 years, is not the absence of wanting more. It is choosing, deliberately, not to take it, even when you could. I watched Vanessa's face during Judge Yu's brief statement, and what I saw there was not defiance. It was the particular collapse of a person realizing, in real time, that a version of the world she had been operating in, a world where certain people simply do not have the power to matter, had just, quietly, and without any raised voices at all, ceased to be true. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She did not respond. She was looking at me, and I let her look, and I did not look away first. I left the courthouse that morning at 9:22 and sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I turned the key. I did not cry. I want to say that clearly, because I think there is a version of this story people expect, the tearful mother-in-law, vindicated, weeping in her car with relief and grief tangled together. That is not what happened, or at least it is not entirely what happened. What I felt, sitting in that parking garage with my hands still resting on the steering wheel, engine off, was something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of having held something perfectly still and perfectly correct for 9 days, and finally being allowed to set it down. And underneath the exhaustion, something more complicated than triumph. I thought of the first Sunday dinner, 2 years earlier, Vanessa laughing at something Daniel said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. The wine she'd brought that cost more than my weekly groceries. I thought of the woman I had genuinely hoped, that first evening, my son had found. Somewhere inside the person who had written she won't ask follow-up questions, she never does about an 81-year-old widow. There had once been, presumably, a young woman who wanted to be good at something, who wanted her father's approval, who had learned, the way so many of us learn things without ever quite choosing to, that being impressive mattered more than being kind. I did not, sitting in that garage, hate her. I grieved her a little. I grieved the daughter-in-law I had hoped for and did not get, the same complicated way you can grieve a house you never got to live in. I sat there long enough that the automatic lights in the parking garage clicked off around me, plunging the car into a dim gray half-light broken only by the exit sign glowing red at the far end of the row, and I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of the very first Sunday dinner, 2 years before, and the exact way Vanessa had laughed at something Daniel said before she ever knew I was watching her inventory the photograph of my mother. There had been nothing performed in that laugh. I am certain of that even now. Whatever else Vanessa Calloway turned out to be capable of, I do not believe the affection she felt for my son, in the beginning, was invented. That is, I think, the part of this story that refuses to resolve itself into anything simple. The part that keeps it from being the kind of tidy morality tale where a villain is only ever a villain. A person can love genuinely and still cause real harm. A person can be capable of warmth at a dinner table and capable of writing. She won't ask follow-up questions. She never does about an 81-year-old widow in the very same year. I do not offer that as an excuse. I offer it only because I think pretending otherwise would make me less honest than I am trying to be with you tonight. In the days between the disclosure hearing and that phone call, I drove out to the old tobacco farm outside Hendersonville, the one from the photograph on my hallway wall, which has belonged to a different family for almost 30 years now, and I parked on the shoulder of the road and simply looked at it for a while, the way I sometimes do when I need to remember where I actually come from before I decide what to do with where I've ended up. The barn my mother once worked around is gone, replaced by a newer one, aluminum-sided, practical and unlovely. The field itself is the same field. I sat there with the engine off and the window down, listening to the wind move through what was left of season's crop, and I thought about the word my mother never once let herself become. No matter how many Thursdays she walked up that Ashford driveway with a basket on her hip, and I thought about the same word, decades later, aimed at me across a restaurant table by a young woman who would go on to learn, the following month, exactly how thoroughly a person can be wrong about who deserves careful words. I called Daniel that evening at 7:15 and told him everything, plainly, without softening it and without exaggerating it either. I told him about the message on the mountain road, which I had never once mentioned to him in the 18 months I had carried it. I told him about the case, about Ruth Whitmore and Harold Beckett's grandsons, about the recusal. I did not tell him what to do with any of it. That was never mine to decide. I only said, at the end, the one thing I felt was actually true and actually mine to say. I love you, and I am always going to love you, no matter what you decide to do next. But I was not going to carry this alone anymore, and I was not going to let you find out from a courtroom instead of from me. There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I checked to make sure the call had not dropped. Then Daniel said, in a voice I had not heard from him since he was a boy, small and stunned, "She called you what?" I called Marion again 3 days after that conversation with Daniel, not because there was any new legal development to discuss, but because I needed simply to hear one more true sentence from someone who had known me long enough to say it plainly. We sat in her office with the door closed, 2 mugs of the terrible courthouse coffee going cold between us, and I told her about Daniel's silence on the phone, the particular weight of it, and Marion said something I have carried with me every day since. "You didn't do this to her, Ellie. She did this to herself in an email 18 months before you ever opened that folder. All you did was refuse to pretend you hadn't read it. There's a difference between revenge and simply declining to lie for someone." I wrote that sentence down on a sticky note and kept it in my desk drawer for the rest of the case, and I read it more than once on the harder evenings, the ones where the exhaustion of holding a secret steady threatened to tip over into something heavier. The performance of normalcy did not end with that one Sunday dinner at the townhouse. It continued for the better part of 9 days, in small, specific moments I still remember with unusual clarity. I remember standing at my own stove on a Tuesday evening, stirring a pot of soup I had no appetite for, while the local news played in the next room, and thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that somewhere across town Vanessa was very likely doing something equally ordinary, answering emails, choosing a paint color, laughing at something on television, with absolutely no idea that the folder crossing my desk existed at all. I remember driving to the grocery store on Thursday and standing in the produce aisle for nearly a full minute, holding a bag of lemons, unable to remember whether I had already picked some up or was only now remembering to. Grief and secrecy, I learned that week, occupy almost exactly the same real estate in a person's chest, and they make you forgetful and careful in precisely the same ways. The case itself proceeded under Judge U over the following 7 months, and I want to be careful to tell you what actually happened rather than what would make the most satisfying story, because the truth, as it usually does, turned out to be both less dramatic and more thorough than any invented ending could have managed. Ashcombe Wealth Partners settled with Ruth Whitmore and the other 2 affected clients 11 weeks after the disclosure hearing, for an amount that restored the bulk of what had been extracted, though not, as Ruth Whitmore's granddaughter told a local reporter, the years of sleepless worry the loss had caused an 81-year-old woman who had simply wanted to stay in her own home. Vanessa was not criminally charged. The conduct, while a clear violation of fiduciary duty and grounds for the civil liability the firm ultimately paid, did not rise to the specific threshold of criminal fraud under state law, a distinction I explained to Daniel as plainly and dispassionately as I could, because I did not want him to walk away from this believing his wife was a criminal when the accurate word was something closer to reckless and unkind, which is its own serious thing but a Different thing. She did lose her position at the firm. The state's financial licensing board opened a separate review that resulted, 4 months later, in the suspension of her advisory license for 18 months. I did not attend the settlement conference, and I did not attend the licensing board hearing. Those were never mine to attend. I read about both when they happened, the way any member of the public reads about a case they once, briefly, held a folder for. The licensing board hearing, in particular, produced one detail I have not been able to stop thinking about, one that Marion mentioned to me almost in passing, since she happened to know the board's chair from her years in the JAG Corps. During her testimony, when asked directly by a board member why she had not simply told Ruth Whitmore the truth about the reallocation, why she had instead described a risky, commission-heavy vehicle as mere diversification, Vanessa reportedly answered, after a long pause, "I told myself I was protecting her from having to understand something complicated. I think, now, that I was actually protecting myself from having to have a harder conversation." I do not know if that answer was sincere or strategic, a genuine flicker of self-awareness, or simply the practiced language of someone who understood that contrition plays well before a licensing board. I choose, for my own peace, to believe it was at least partly sincere, because I think even the people who do real harm are rarely made of nothing but harm, and I would rather extend that grace than withhold it, even toward someone who once decided my whole life could be summarized in 2 careless words at a dinner table. Daniel and Vanessa separated 3 months after the disclosure hearing. I want to say, honestly, that I take no satisfaction in that fact, and I did not encourage it. And when Daniel called to tell me, I did not say "I told you so," because I never once, in the entire 18 months I carried that message, told him so in the first place. I only listened. He moved back into an apartment near his office for a while. Vanessa kept the townhouse, briefly, before selling it, the crown molding, the kitchen island, and moving back to Charlotte, into a smaller place near her sister, the same sister whose group chat had once carried a sentence about my cardigan into my phone by accident. I want to tell you what happened to Vanessa, factually, without gloating, because gloating would betray everything I actually believe about how a life like this should be told. 11 months after the licensing suspension, she took a position, an entry-level one, considerably below the title she'd held at Ashcombe, at a small firm in Charlotte that specializes in compliance consulting, the unglamorous, detail-heavy work of making sure other advisors do not do what she once did. I learned this not through any investigation of my own, but through Daniel, who has stayed, to his credit, on cordial enough terms with her to know, and who mentioned it once, almost in passing, in the tone of someone reporting weather rather than justice. Sometimes the bottom is the only honest place to start building something real, and from what Daniel tells me, she has, by all accounts, been good at the new work, careful, thorough, the particular kind of careful that people who have been publicly humbled sometimes become, at least for a while. I do not know if it will last. I have learned on the bench that character revealed under pressure is more reliable than character performed after consequences have already landed, and only time will tell which one this turns out to be. I hope honestly that it lasts. I do not say that to be generous for the sake of appearing generous. I say it because I do not actually want to see anyone destroyed. I only ever wanted the truth to be visible to the people it had been hidden from. 1 year to the week after that disclosure hearing, I am sitting on my own back porch at 6:50 in the evening. In October light, that falls the exact same amber gold across the yard it fell across that courtroom window the morning everything changed, and Daniel's headlights are turning up the gravel drive. He comes out most Sundays now, alone these days, and we sit on this porch and eat whatever I've made. That particular Sunday it was chicken and dumplings, his father's favorite, made from Walter's own mother's recipe card, the one with the corner burned slightly from an oven mishap decades before I ever met him. Daniel is dating someone new, a schoolteacher named Priya, careful and warm in a way that reminds me, more than I have told him, of the boy who used to shout that he'd found a better room. I still drive the Escape, cracked windshield and all. I finally got around to fixing it in the spring, mostly because Daniel nagged me about it for 6 months straight, which I have decided to take as a form of love. I still wear the cardigans. I have not bought a single new one since any of this happened, and I do not intend to, because the cardigan was never the problem, And a woman who changes her wardrobe because someone once used it as an insult has let that person win something they were never actually entitled to. The small daily joy I did not expect in the year since is this. Daniel calls me now, most weeks, not to report a crisis or ask advice, but simply to talk. About nothing. About work. About a book he's reading. About Priya's terrible cooking, which he describes with an affection that makes clear he does not actually mind it at all. We had drifted, in those 2 years of Vanessa's marriage, without either of us quite naming it as drifting. Sunday dinners that felt performed rather than easy. A distance that crept in so slowly neither of us marked the exact date it arrived. That distance is gone now. My son calls me on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all, and I answer, and we talk for 20 minutes about absolutely nothing, and I sit afterward at my kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand and think that this, an ordinary phone call, unremarkable, unnecessary, is worth more than any verdict a courtroom could ever hand down. There is a second relationship, healthier and newer, that I want to mention here as well, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this resolution. Ruth Whitmore, the widow whose voicemail I read that night at my kitchen table, wrote me a letter roughly 7 months after the settlement, forwarded through the clerk of court once the case had fully closed, and it was appropriate for her to know which judge had originally, briefly, held her file. It was 2 pages, handwritten, the penmanship of a woman who had clearly been taught cursive in a one-room schoolhouse decades before either of us were old enough to vote. She thanked me, plainly, for what she called doing the right thing even though it must have cost you something at home. And she told me, almost as an aside in the second paragraph, that she had used part of the restored settlement to help her granddaughter in Knoxville put a down payment on a small house, the first the young woman had ever owned. I keep that letter in the same desk drawer where I once kept Marion's sticky note, and on the harder days, because there are still harder days, even a year out, even with Daniel's calls and the fixed windshield and the chicken and dumplings on Sunday nights, I take it out and read it again, and I am reminded of the actual, specific human cost of the thing I quietly refuse to look away from. Here is the truth this whole story was ultimately about. The one sentence I would want you to carry out of here if you carry nothing else. The people who work hardest to convince you that your quiet life is a small life are almost always the ones most afraid of what a quiet life actually protects. Vanessa Calloway did not call me poor trash because she genuinely believed my cardigan and my modest kitchen meant I had failed at something. She called me that because a life built slowly, honestly, without display, is a kind of life that has no interest in her particular scoreboard, and a person who has organized their entire identity around a scoreboard finds nothing more threatening than someone who has quietly opted out of playing. I want to speak, for a moment, directly to a few different people who might be watching this tonight, because I suspect you are not all in the same place, and I do not want to speak only to the loudest version of this story. Some of you are the mother-in-law in the cardigan. Some of you are the Daniel, the adult child who did not hear the comment, and will want to know if you had. Some of you, if I am honest, may see a little of yourself in Vanessa, and if that is true, I do not say any of this to condemn you. I say it because the version of this story where she had simply asked one more follow-up question, where she had simply called Ruth Whitmore back within the hour instead of 11 days, is a version where none of this happens at all, and it is never too late to become the person who asks the follow-up question. If you are the person right now sitting at someone else's table, in your good cardigan, having just been quietly diminished by someone who does not know the full weight of who you actually are, I want you to hear me say this plainly. You do not owe anyone a performance of your worth. Let them underestimate you. Underestimation, held correctly, is not a wound. It is information. It tells you exactly how much you should trust that person with the parts of your life that actually matter, which, in my experience, is considerably less than you were trusting them with before. I promise you, the discomfort of being underestimated is a far lighter weight to carry than the exhaustion of constantly proving yourself to someone who has already decided, in advance, not to be convinced. If you are an adult child watching a parent be quietly disrespected by someone you love, and you have not known how to bring it up, or whether it is even your place to, I want you to know that your parent very likely already knows exactly what is happening, and is very likely protecting you from it the same way I protected my son for 18 months. Not out of weakness, but out of love. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to say gently, "Has anything ever felt off to you?" It is not betrayal to open that door. It is one of the most loving things you can do. Daniel has told me, more than once this past year, that he wishes I had told him sooner, and I understand that wish, and I still would not have chosen differently, because I believe some truths need to arrive at exactly their own pace, and a parent's job is sometimes simply to make sure the truth, whenever it finally does arrive, does not arrive alone. If you are someone still deep inside the hard part of a story like this one, still sitting at the table, still absorbing the comment, still years away from any folder crossing any desk, I want you to know that you are not required to wait for a dramatic reversal to feel whole again. Justice, when it comes, is a wonderful thing, but it is not the source of your worth, and it never was. Your worth was never actually in question, no matter how convincingly someone insisted otherwise. And if you are the person who has spent your whole life being underestimated because of what you drive, or what you wear, or where you came from, or how quietly you built what you built, I want you to hear this, because I believe it with everything I have. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two entirely different things, and only one of them is actually a reflection of your character. Here is one practical thing I would ask you to do this week. If any part of the story landed somewhere true in you, if there is someone in your life whose comments about you, your home, your car, your job, your clothes, have started to feel less like observations and more like verdicts, write down the last 3 things they said to you, word for word, as close as you can remember them, not to build a case, not to confront anyone, simply to see them written down, outside your own head, in plain daylight, where it becomes much harder to talk yourself out of what you already know to be true. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop letting a cruel sentence live only in the private, deniable space of memory, and give it the small, sobering weight of ink on paper. I would add one more practical thing for the specific person listening tonight who manages money, or property, or paperwork, for someone older or more trusting than they are, a parent, a grandparent, a client, a neighbor you've taken under your wing. Call them this week, not with an accusation, but with one plain question. Is there anything about your accounts, your statements, your paperwork, that has ever confused you and that you were too embarrassed to ask about? You would be surprised, in my experience both on the bench and in my own family, how many people have been quietly carrying a version of Ruth Whitmore's Sunday night voicemail in their own chest for months, waiting for someone to finally make it safe enough to ask. I will leave you with the question I have been sitting with myself, on this porch, in this October light, for the better part of a year now. Is there someone in your life you have been quietly shrinking yourself for, hoping that if you take up less space, they might finally decide you belong? And if the answer is yes, I would ask you gently, the way Marion once asked me, how much longer exactly? Do you plan on waiting for a verdict that was never actually theirs to give? If this story found something true in you tonight, I would love to hear from you in the comments, because I read every single one, and they matter to me more than I think most people expect. Drop a 1 if you believe I made the right choice by recusing quietly and letting the truth surface through the process, rather than confronting her myself. Drop a 2 if you think there was a part of the story where you would have handled it differently, and you want to tell me what that part was. Drop a 3 if some piece of the story, the cardigan, the group chat, the folder on the desk, the phone call with your own child, touched something real that has actually happened in your own life. I read those comments most nights before I turn out the lamp, sitting in the same chair where I once read Ruth Whitmore's letter, and I have come to think of that small ritual as its own kind of Sunday dinner table, one that stretches farther than any dining room ever could. And before you go, tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it is where you are right now. Someone is going to watch this at 2 in the morning, from somewhere I would never guess, unable to sleep for reasons only they know. And somehow this will turn out to be exactly the story they needed to hear before they finally closed their eyes. That happens more often than you would think, and it means something to me every single time I read those comments and realize it happened again. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Asheville, North Carolina to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, your local adult protective services, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet sound you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.